The market town of Flaxborough had never pretended to be remarkable, its high street curved with a modest dignity, and its shop fronts, a careful mix of Victorian restraint and post-war compromise, reflected the town's lifelong obsession with appearing orderly, if slightly behind the times. On a particularly brisk spring morning, the air smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and polished leather. An aroma Mr. Hedges, the town's undertaker, claimed was the smell of Flaxborough getting ready for anything. It was the sort of morning that suited the weekly auction at Mortimer and Prance's, a small establishment that combined the charm of antiquity with the faint, ever-present whiff of turpentine. The auctioneer, Mr. Cedric Prance, had decided that today's catalogue would include a rather curious item, a leather-bound diary, apparently unearthed, in the attic of the late Miss Henrietta Crimble, a socialite-turned-travel writer who had died, somewhat ignominiously, nearly a century earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Prance announced, his voice a careful combination of pomp and familiarity, "we have before us an extraordinary artifact, the personal diary of one Miss Henrietta Crimble, whose adventures in the early 20th century were the stuff of whispered legend and polite scandal. I need hardly remind you, this diary is 100 years old and contains observations of society and its less savoury characters. One can only speculate as to the influence it may have exerted on her contemporaries, or, indeed, on us." There was a stir among the audience, a mixture of curiosity and polite scepticism. Mrs. Penrose, wearing her Sunday hat with the feather that had survived 3 royal coronations, leaned forward with a scandalized gleam in her eye. 100 years? She murmured to her companion, Mrs. Frobisher. "And it has not been published?" "Apparently not," murmured Mrs. Frobisher, whose spectacles magnified the look of perpetual suspicion she wore like a badge. "One wonders why. If it were a mere account of promenades and garden parties, it would hardly have survived this long." Outside, the town clock chimed with unerring regularity. Inside, the chatter rose gently, then paused for the auctioneer to lift the diary in the air, its leather worn, the edges frayed. Inspector Purbright, for his part, arrived quietly, as he usually did, noting the subtle hierarchy of interest. Mr. Prance's display table had drawn the expected crowd, Mrs. Penrose and Mrs. Frobisher, the town librarian Mr. Langford, whose obsession with cataloguing anything remotely old was well known, and a small cadre of students from the nearby grammar school who had been promised a lecture on historical minutiae. Purbright's attention, however, was not on the diary itself, but on the reactions of those around it, the polite tension, the almost imperceptible elbowing for a better view, the barely concealed envy among the older female attendees. Purbright had noticed these little things before. In Flaxborough, as elsewhere, the extraordinary often hid beneath the ordinary. One needed only to look for the tiny disturbances in otherwise unremarkable behaviour. The bidding began. Initially, offers were mild, as if everyone were testing the waters. Mr. Langford's hand twitched nervously, as though he might blurt out his interest in an inappropriate manner. Mrs. Penrose adjusted her hat and murmured a commentary about the vulgarity of public auctions. The crowd reacted with the sort of polite giggle that accompanies well-timed social disapproval. Then, unexpectedly, a young woman from the rear of the room, hardly known in Flaxborough circles, dressed in something vaguely modern and deliberately unremarkable, raised her paddle. £10, she said crisply, as if stating a fact rather than making an offer. A murmur went through the room. £10 was not extraordinary, but the certainty in her tone suggested more than mere enthusiasm. Mr. Prance, slightly flustered, raised his eyebrows. 15, came a voice from the front row. Mr. Langford, of course. The bidding escalated quietly, with polite interjections and the occasional gasp. But when the final hammer fell, it was the young woman, Miss Felicity Harrow, a name Purbright had heard once or twice, always attached to whispered discussions of modern influence and peculiar social projects, who claimed the diary. And that, as Purbright had learned over many years, was when the ordinary begins to feel extraordinary. He made a mental note of the peculiarities, the modern girl in a traditional crowd, the surprisingly low reserve for such an artifact, and the subtle but telling tension among the regular attendees. Something about the diary, the auction, or perhaps the way it was coveted, promised to unsettle more than just the room. Outside, the wind rattled the awnings along the high street. Inside, Purbright observed quietly, noting the interplay of anticipation, envy, and the smallest ripple of social pride. He had no idea yet what mystery awaited, but he sensed, with his usual quiet certitude, that this unremarkable morning in Flaxborough had just acquired an unusually sharp edge. By the time the auction ended, news of the diary's purchase had already begun its quiet peregrination through Flaxborough. Townsfolk, in that peculiar and remarkably efficient way of small communities, seemed to absorb information like fine mesh sieves, retaining only the bits that could be embroidered into their daily narratives. At the post office, Mr. Dalloway polished the counter with conscientious regularity, pausing to comment on Miss Harrow's audacity. "Did you see her?" he said to Mrs. Battersby, who collected the pension envelopes with an air of weary toleration. "Straight from somewhere foreign, no doubt, and she snatches a thing that's been in Flaxborough for 100 years. Mrs. Battersby, whose eyes were always rimmed with the suspicion of one who has seen too much in the High Street, tutted politely. "Some things," she murmured, "are not meant to be trifled with. A diary isn't merely paper, it's a life, and a century's worth at that." Even the butcher, Mr. Thornley, who spent his mornings arranging sausages with artisanal precision, seemed to find the acquisition worthy of mild outrage. "An outsider taking what belongs to Flaxborough," he muttered to the junior assistant, who nodded uncertainly, afraid to appear uninformed or too interested. Purbright, observing from the quiet corner of the post office, made no immediate comment. He had noted how the gossip shifted almost imperceptibly depending on each observer's social inclinations. Those inclined toward tradition emphasized propriety and ownership, while the younger, more impressionable faction fixated on novelty and excitement. The diary itself had become a catalyst, a lens through which the minutiae of Flaxborough's social order could be examined. By mid-morning, the town library had become a hub of conjecture. Mr. Langford, clutching his spectacles in a manner that suggested the weight of responsibility, had convened a small, informal gathering of like-minded intellectuals. "Miss Harrow," he said with deliberate gravity, "may well have purchased not merely a diary but a key to understanding our collective past. Or perhaps she intends to exploit it for some commercial enterprise. Influencers have a way of transforming relics into currency, one might say." "Currency," echoed young Miss Yates, the librarian's assistant, who had never before been entrusted with such a discussion, and whose cheeks betrayed both excitement and fear. "Do you think she'll post it online, make it public?" Langford sniffed. "Public, private, or somewhere in between? We can only guess. What is indisputable, however, is the effect this diary will have on Flaxborough's delicate equilibrium. Secrets long buried tend to surface when least expected." Outside the library, the high street hummed with its usual rhythm. The bell over the chemist's door jingled with every customer, and the grocer, Mr. Crampton, offered small pieces of news along with his apples and cabbages. In every shop, at every counter, the diary's acquisition became a quiet, persistent motif. Words transformed into embellishments. "She is very young? A foreign type, surely. I heard she knows someone in London publishing circles. 100 years, and untouched. Purbright, passing from shop to shop under the pretence of his weekly inspections, noted with discreet interest the subtle shifts in tone. The gossip was not malicious exactly. It was more a measure of each resident's sense of ownership over the town's past. They were not merely discussing a book, they were discussing themselves, their histories, and the town's quietly cherished proprieties. By early afternoon, even the vicar, Reverend Appleyard, had been drawn into conversation at the tea-room. He sipped his Earl Grey with a patient air, nodding to the commentaries of local women while mentally cataloguing the implications. "Influence," he murmured, mostly to himself, "comes in many forms. Miss Harrow may mean no harm, yet one cannot ignore the subtle disruptions she may inadvertently cause." The diary, meanwhile, had been carried away in Miss Harrow's neat black bag, and she had disappeared into a series of errands that promised anonymity. Yet her presence, her acquisition, had already left an indelible mark. Flaxborough's rhythm, previously predictable, now contained a note of perturbation. Eyes lingered on empty shop fronts as though expecting secrets to emerge from the unremarkable, and conversations carried the delicate tension of anticipation, each speaker hoping to appear informed while subtly testing the knowledge of others. Purbright, returning to the quiet sanctuary of his office, allowed himself a small smile. He made a note of the ripples. Who noticed what? Who embellished? Who speculated? And who remained quietly indifferent? All of this, he understood, would serve as much as any tangible clue. In Flaxborough, it was rarely the object itself that revealed the truth, but the intricate patterns of human response surrounding it. And as he sipped his tea, listening to the distant chimes of the market clock, Purbright considered the diary's journey, from the dusty attic of Miss Crimble to the hands of a modern girl whose motives were, as yet, unknown. He could not yet see where the story would lead, but he could sense the subtle frictions that would soon demand careful attention. Somewhere within these quiet disturbances lay the seed of a mystery, one that, like the diary itself, had the potential to stir century-old secrets into the present. Inspector Purbright began his inquiries with the measured pace that had become his signature. There was no urgency in Flaxborough. One's own pace, one's own observation, often revealed far more than rushed speculation. He first called upon Miss Harrow at her lodgings, a modest residence on the far side of the High Street, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint, exotic perfume she carried, as if to announce herself even in the quietest corridors. She greeted him politely with a careful neutrality that was neither inviting nor forbidding. Purbright observed her manner, noting the slight tension in her shoulders and the precision with which she arranged the diary on the table before offering tea. "I trust your journey was uneventful, Inspector?" she asked, almost as if testing him. "Indeed," Purbright said softly, taking the seat she indicated. "I understand you have recently acquired a rather notable item from Mr. Prance's auction. I hope you will forgive my curiosity. It is, after all, my duty to ensure that Flaxborough's historical artifacts are treated with proper care." Miss Harrow smiled faintly, a measured gesture that revealed nothing. "Of course, I was quite taken with the diary. I have no intention of harming it. I merely wish to understand its contents." Purbright allowed the silence to linger a moment longer than polite etiquette would typically permit. Observing the young woman's reactions to his quiet, deliberate pauses often revealed more than direct questioning ever could. "And have you had occasion to examine the diary closely yet?" he asked. "Only briefly," she replied. "I am careful. There are, I imagine, some very personal details. It seems, in places, almost too modern for its age." Her eyes flicked to a small engraving on the diary's cover, the faint indentation of a name long since worn. The inspector made a mental note. Her attention to detail was genuine, yet the almost imperceptible hesitation suggested she was hiding some curiosity or anticipation. He accepted the tea, thanked her, and departed with his customary quietude, leaving the impression of civil courtesy while noting the subtle frictions that lingered around her words. Next, he spoke with Mr. Langford at the library. The librarian had already compiled a modest but meticulous dossier of Miss Crimble's known acquaintances, correspondences, and minor scandals. She was quite influential in certain circles, Langford explained, adjusting his spectacles. Not of the grand political sort, but in the subtler realm. Social influence, you might say. Miss Harrow may not realize how delicate these details are. Purbright nodded, listening more than he spoke. He noted Langford's emphasis on influence and subtlety, aware that obsession often masked envy. "And is it your view that these details, were they to become public, could cause difficulty for the town?" he asked. Langford hesitated, clearly choosing his words with care. Perhaps not for the town as a whole, but certain families, certain reputations. Minor ripples, yes, but far-reaching in the sense of social equilibrium. Satisfied with the initial responses, Purbright continued, moving along the high street to speak with Mr. Thornley, the butcher, who had a natural tendency to narrate the moral climate of the town as he sliced his meats. Thornley's account was a blend of factual reporting and personal conjecture. "People are worried," he said, chopping with deliberate rhythm. "Not about the diary itself, no, it's old, dusty, hardly more than paper, but about what she might find or think she has found. Old stories, old grudges, they have a way of rising to the surface when least expected." As always, Purbright noted the choice of words. "Rising to the surface," he murmured internally. The butcher's phrasing was not unique, but the pattern of concern it reflected was informative. He thanked Thornley politely, making no sign of the quiet, observations taking root in his mind. By late afternoon, Purbright had accumulated a subtle mosaic of opinions and half-statements, each revealing a fragment of human behavior rather than concrete evidence. The diary itself remained untouched in Miss Harrow's possession, yet its presence had already produced discernible effects: heightened attention, understated anxiety, and the faintest undertones of rivalry among those who considered themselves custodians of the town's heritage. In his office, Purbright laid out his notes with deliberate care. He made no comment on the young woman's acquisition, instead recording the small contradictions. Langford's restrained insistence on propriety, Thornley's dramatic phrasing, Miss Harrow's cautious curiosity. Each in isolation might appear mundane. Together they hinted at patterns that were yet to reveal their significance. As dusk settled over Flaxborough, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets, Purbright allowed himself a private thought. A single diary, innocuous to the untrained eye, had stirred a variety of emotions: curiosity, anxiety, pride, and envy. Such emotional currents, he knew, were far more telling than any explicit declaration. And in these currents, he sensed, lay the first faint threads of a mystery that would demand patience, observation, and the careful application of his own particular methods. The diary, silent and unassuming, had become a mirror of the town itself, reflecting desires and secrets that otherwise might have remained buried. Purbright leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet of his office absorb the residual noises from the high street, aware that tomorrow would require further gentle probing, and that in such probing the town's concealed truths would begin, imperceptibly, to reveal themselves. By mid-morning the following day, Flaxborough had settled into a curious rhythm of expectation, as though the diary's arrival had subtly rearranged the social geometry of the town. Inspector Purbright, moving with his usual unobtrusive diligence, noted that several individuals had begun to assume the posture of self-appointed guardians of propriety. Chief among them was Mr. Langford, the librarian, whose previous mild concern had blossomed into something resembling urgency. Purbright found him rearranging books at an unusual hour, muttering under his breath about misplaced manuscripts and public interest. "Inspector," Langford said, adjusting his spectacles with precise impatience, "it is quite clear that the diary's contents should remain in the hands of those who understand their historical value. Miss Harrow, as charming as she may be, is dangerously naive." "Dangerously naive?" Purbright repeated, arching a brow. Langford's response was immediate, almost rehearsed. "She may be well-intentioned, of course, but influence is not a game to be handled lightly. One word, one anecdote from that diary could upset families, reputations, even our own town council quietly, without a trace until it is too late." Purbright listened, carefully noting the subtle moral indignation threading Langford's words. The librarian's certainty, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, suggested that he was personally invested in the diary's preservation, and in controlling access to it. That very investment, he thought, made Langford an obvious candidate for suspicion should anything untoward occur. Later, at the post office, Mrs. Battersby mentioned the previous day's auction to a cluster of acquaintances, her tone equal parts curiosity and judgment. "And you know Mr. Langford was quite perturbed, as if someone had stolen more than a book. I dare say he believes the diary should belong to him, in some sense." Purbright filed that remark away. He had long understood that possessiveness often masquerades as civic duty. Langford's scholarly demeanour, his meticulous notes, and his insistence on the diary's delicate treatment suggested he could, if circumstances inclined, act in ways motivated by both pride and fear. Curiosity drew him next to Mr. Thornley, who, despite his focus on meat, had not escaped the ripple effect of the diary. "I saw Langford muttering again this morning," the butcher confided, carving a particularly stubborn joint. "He's worried, more worried than anyone ought to be. You can see it in his eyes, almost as if he believes he has a stake in the thing more than propriety alone could justify." Purbright nodded, noting the corroboration. Both observations, though filtered through ordinary conversation, indicated the same subtle inclination. Langford's interest was personal, emotional, and unusually fervent. The inspector returned to Miss Harrow's lodgings under the guise of courtesy, ostensibly to check on the diary's condition. She received him with calm politeness, though her posture suggested she had anticipated the visit. "The diary is quite secure," she assured him, her tone neutral, measured. "I understand your concern for the town's historical treasures." Purbright, sipping his tea with deliberate slowness, allowed the words to hang. "You have taken care to maintain its condition," he observed, "and it has not yet been exhibited to anyone else?" "No," she said. "I prefer to understand it first." Her response was precise, but the inspector noted a slight hesitation when she glanced at the diary, as if a thought or memory had momentarily unsettled her. That tiny flicker was almost imperceptible, yet he recorded it, alongside Langford's fervour and the butcher's commentary. By late afternoon, patterns began to emerge in Purbright's mind. Langford, with his carefully cultivated aura of scholarly duty, and Miss Harrow, with her deliberate curiosity, represented the poles around which the diary's influence revolved. One, predictable in obsession, and the other, unpredictable in naivety. Between them, the quiet tensions of Flaxborough's social fabric hummed like a taut string. Purbright made no judgment aloud. He understood the value of allowing townspeople to expose themselves gradually through words and deeds. The diary, though physically inert, had become a prism reflecting hidden desires, latent ambitions and unspoken grievances. That evening, as the high street emptied and the lamps flickered to life, he noted the first signs of restlessness. Langford, walking with unusually brisk steps, Miss Harrow pacing in her sitting room, and Thornley cleaning counters with distracted intensity. All were ordinary actions, yet in the subtle language of human behaviour, they spoke volumes. Purbright returned to his office, laying out the observations with methodical care. The first obvious suspect in the eyes of the town and perhaps of common sense was already identifiable. Langford, whose protective zeal over the diary combined with his scholarly pride and emotional investment positioned him squarely at the centre of potential intrigue. Yet Purbright's mind remained deliberately open. He recorded the details, noting the faint anomalies, the hesitations, the small gestures. For now, the diary's presence had created a single focal point for suspicion, but he sensed, as he often did, that reality would prove more complex, and that the first obvious conclusion was rarely the final one. The next morning, Flaxborough awakened under a sky that threatened drizzle, but delivered only a persistent grey drizzle, the sort that left the cobbled streets glistening, and the air smelling faintly of damp earth and coal smoke. Inspector Purbright, attending to his usual rounds, noticed a detail almost immediately, though he could not yet explain its significance. A small slip of paper, folded with deliberate care, tucked beneath the handle of Miss Harrow's lodgings' front door. Curious, he retrieved it and unfolded the note, revealing a single line written in neat, flowing handwriting. "The past watches more closely than you think." Purbright examined it with the patient attention of one who knows that meaning often hides beneath simplicity. The paper bore no signature, no trace of ink irregularity, and yet the very existence of such a message suggested the subtle presence of observation, and by implication, a watcher who knew more than they allowed. That afternoon he called again upon Mr. Langford, ostensibly to discuss the diary's provenance, though the note lingered at the back of his mind. Langford's eyes, usually so controlled, flickered with what might have been curiosity or unease. "I assume, Inspector, that Miss Harrow is careful with the diary?" he asked, his tone lightly admonishing. "Yes," Purbright replied, letting his voice suggest a measure of mild concern without pressing. "She has shown remarkable diligence. Yet one wonders," he added, allowing a gentle pause, "how the diary's presence might attract attention beyond the immediate circle of interest." Langford stiffened imperceptibly, just enough for the inspector to note it. There was a subtle twitch in his fingers as he adjusted his spectacles. "Attention," he repeated slowly. "I do hope no one is interfering. That would be most regrettable." Later, as he walked through the high street, Purbright reflected on the note. Its wording implied a sense of surveillance, a claim to knowledge that suggested both subtle threat and intimate awareness. He considered the possibilities, a prank perhaps, or the first evidence of someone manipulating circumstances from behind the scenes. The triviality of a single scrap of paper belied the potential disruption it could signify, a small pebble that might cause ripples in otherwise calm waters. At the tea room, Mrs. Battersby and several acquaintances debated the auction, unaware that the diary had already prompted Purbright's quiet investigation. "It is odd, is it not?" she said, leaning on her parasol. "That Miss Harrow's appearance coincides with Langford's sudden interest in matters he barely mentioned before?" Her companion, Mrs. Penrose, nodded, her own eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and implied accusation. Curious indeed, and to think one small book could unsettle the calm of Flaxborough. One wonders what might come of it. Purbright observed these exchanges with his customary restraint, noting the patterns, the half-formed suspicions, the implied judgments. Every whisper, every glance, even the smallest repetition of a phrase, contributed to a map of human behavior, one more revealing than the diary's contents themselves. By late afternoon, he returned to Miss Harrow's lodgings, intending only a casual inquiry about her day. She received him politely, arranging a modest tea with precision, though her eyes betrayed faint distraction. "Inspector," she said, "I found this note tucked beneath the door this morning. It seems odd, though I cannot imagine its intent." Purbright accepted the paper, observing her calm yet slightly tense demeanour. "Odd, perhaps," he said, "but sometimes the smallest oddity proves the most instructive. It indicates awareness, presence, the possibility that someone in town is monitoring events more closely than one might imagine." Miss Harrow considered this, nodding slowly. "It may be a warning," she said, "though I cannot fathom from whom or why." Purbright made no immediate response. He noted the careful phrasing, the calm but tense delivery, and the subtle pause before she spoke. These, he realized, were clues as telling as any explicit confession could be. The triviality of a single note in a town as quiet and orderly as Flaxborough might unsettle or provoke far more than the apparent seriousness of the message suggested. By evening, Purbright was seated at his desk, reviewing his notes, the diary, Langford's zealous attention, Miss Harrow's meticulous handling, and now the mysterious note combined into a faint but discernible pattern. Nothing had yet erupted into overt incident, yet the potential for disturbance had increased. In Flaxborough, small towns often hid vast intricacies beneath ordinary facades. A single scrap of paper, folded and left with discretion, might not seem significant to an observer who missed the rhythm of human behavior, but to Purbright it spoke volumes. He understood that it was not the diary itself that posed risk, but the attention, the awareness, and the subtle interplay of motives that it had triggered. The stage, he realized, had been quietly set for consequences that would unfold with deliberate unpredictability, and the first trivial but odd detail had already begun to cast its shadow over the town. By mid-morning, Flaxborough had settled into the quiet rhythm that follows curiosity, yet Inspector Purbright was aware that beneath the surface subtle currents were stirring. The diary had not yet caused any overt disturbance, but its presence had begun to reveal facets of character in residents who ordinarily maintained a careful civility. Purbright moved deliberately, visiting the broader circle of townsfolk who might be affected, or conversely, who might seize upon the diary's existence for their own ends. He first stopped at the stationer's shop, where Mr. Quimby, an otherwise unremarkable man with a penchant for neat ink lines and precise ledger-keeping, offered his usual greeting with an added edge of interest. "Inspector, have you noticed how certain people linger near the auction site?" Quimby asked, adjusting his pince-nez. "It is as though they are hoping to glimpse more than just the lot. One wonders what motivations lie beneath polite appearances." Purbright nodded, observing the subtle tension in Quimby's tone. The stationer's meticulous mind often grasped nuances unnoticed by others. "And do you consider these motivations dangerous?" he asked gently, allowing room for inference. Quimby paused, counting his words with care. "Not dangerous, perhaps, but revealing. People cannot help but show their true inclinations when there is something to be gained, or something they wish to preserve." From there, Purbright visited the bakery, where Mrs. Delaney, a woman as sharp-tongued as she was skilled in producing flaky pastries, whispered of minor scandals long considered settled. "I dare say," she confided, slicing bread with exaggerated care, "that some families who believe themselves immune to attention will soon find themselves under scrutiny, The diary will illuminate much, whether one wishes it or not." Her remark, seemingly casual, carried undercurrents of observation and judgment. Purbright filed it alongside Quimby's insight, noting that the diary's presence had become a lens, refracting hidden desires and dormant resentments across the town's social lattice. Later, he encountered Mr. and Mrs. Fairclough, proprietors of a small antiques shop, who expressed mild astonishment that a mere book could generate so much interest. "It is hardly the first diary in Flaxborough," Mrs. Fairclough said, her tone mingling scepticism with intrigue. "Yet the fuss, one wonders if there is something particular about Miss Crimble's words." Purbright allowed the remark to settle. "People often ascribe significance to objects beyond their intrinsic value," he said quietly. "It is the responses they provoke, rather than the objects themselves, that frequently reveal the truth of character." The inspector's observations revealed a pattern. Nearly every household he visited reflected a variant of the same phenomena. Curiosity had a gentle, yet inexorable way of awakening latent rivalry, modest ambition, and quiet envy. Even the most outwardly indifferent townsfolk exhibited subtle signs of attention. A lingering glance, a carefully phrased remark, the faint tightening of lips. By mid-afternoon, Purbright returned to Miss Harrow's lodgings, ostensibly to discuss minor details regarding the diary's preservation. She received him with measured civility, her composure unshaken, though he noticed a faint tension in her hands as she adjusted the leather binding. "I have reviewed a few entries," she said quietly, "and I confess that some passages seem pointed, almost as if addressing future generations." Purbright considered her words. Pointed, perhaps, yet ambiguity is often deliberate. One does not always write to clarify, but to observe, to suggest, and sometimes to provoke reflection. Miss Harrow nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "It is remarkable that a book so old can still cause unease. One might almost say it unsettles people without them knowing why." "And in Flaxborough," Purbright said gently, "people are highly attuned to the slightest disturbance of order. Even minor curiosities can produce disproportionate effects, which is why I am taking careful note of reactions as well as events themselves." By evening, the inspector sat quietly in his office, cataloguing the day's observations. The expanded field revealed that the diary's presence touched nearly every segment of Flaxborough society, from the meticulous shopkeepers to the gossipy homemakers, each exhibiting a distinct mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and ambition. The interactions suggested that a larger network of motives and reactions was emerging, one that would eventually clarify the diary's true significance and the subtle forces it had released. Purbright allowed himself a small smile. The town, apparently tranquil, was quietly revealing its underlying structures. Rivalries, loyalties, and secret resentments had begun to surface in manners so slight they might have been dismissed by a less observant eye. And within these small, carefully observed responses lay the foundation for future developments, threads that would eventually converge into clarity. The diary was merely the spark. The patterns of human nature would provide the fire. The following morning brought a subtle shift to Flaxborough's otherwise predictable routine. A light mist hung over the high street, curling around lampposts and shop fronts, softening the outlines of familiar buildings and giving the town an unexpectedly unfamiliar air. Inspector Purbright, already attentive to the minutiae of local life, sensed that the town's equilibrium was about to be further unsettled. The second incident occurred with almost innocuous timing. It was Mrs. Delaney, the baker, who first noticed the disruption. She had arrived early to arrange her pastries when she discovered that a small, framed photograph of Miss Crimble, which had been kept on the ledge above the shop counter, had vanished. The frame itself was found lying face down on the tiled floor, dust scattered as if someone had handled it with hesitation rather than malice. The loss, minor in its physical impact, carried implications far larger. The photograph had been a local curiosity for decades, a visual anchor to the memory of Miss Crimble, whose writings and social escapades had already entered town lore. Its removal suggested deliberate intervention, a statement that something within the town was shifting, and that the diary was no longer merely an object of scholarly curiosity, but a catalyst for action. Purbright arrived promptly, moving with the quiet authority that never startled even the most nervous of townsfolk. He examined the scene with careful attention, noting the orientation of the frame, the absence of fingerprints beyond the ordinary, and the dust disturbance that suggested a single, deliberate handling rather than casual misplacement. "Was there anyone in the shop earlier than usual?" he asked Mrs. Delaney, who wrung her hands as she considered the question. "Not that I noticed," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I was first in, as usual. The door was locked. I suppose someone could have come during the night." Purbright noted the possibility but withheld immediate judgment. Overnight access was plausible but not yet certain, and assumptions could mislead. He allowed the baker to describe her routine in full, listening closely to inflections, hesitations, and the minor inconsistencies that so often revealed more than direct statements. Next, he spoke with Miss Harrow, who expressed visible disquiet at the news. "The photograph?" she murmured. "It has always been a minor keepsake. I cannot imagine who would wish to remove it. It seems unnecessarily provocative." Purbright observed her carefully. There was genuine surprise in her tone, but beneath it a faint tension, almost imperceptible, that suggested she was considering the implications as much as the event itself. "It is a minor object," he said softly, "yet its removal indicates interest. Beyond casual curiosity, someone is attentive to the diary and its associated artifacts." Later, as he spoke with Mr. Langford, the librarian's composure appeared momentarily disturbed. "A photograph?" he said, a faint tremor in his voice. "I cannot imagine. Or someone may wish to disturb the narrative, to test the reactions of those involved. It is unsettling." His pause was significant, longer than propriety demanded, revealing more through hesitation than words could articulate. Purbright noted that the first obvious suspect, Langford, while still invested in the diary, now faced a complication. The removal of the photograph did not bear hallmarks of his careful stewardship. The timing, the minimal disturbance, and the seemingly whimsical choice of object suggested that another party or an unexpected intervention might be at play. By mid-afternoon, whispers spread through the town. At the post office, Mrs. Battersby shared news with measured enthusiasm. "It is gone," she said, lowering her voice as though the diary itself might overhear. "The photograph of Miss Crimble has vanished. I do not know why, but some people are clearly restless." The diary, still in Miss Harrow's possession, had inadvertently provoked a second, subtler act of disruption. Purbright walked along the high street, observing glances exchanged, nods of speculation, and the faint tightening of lips among those who fancied themselves custodians of propriety. The removal of the photograph was minor, yet the implications were significant. It demonstrated action where before there had been only anticipation. By evening, Purbright returned to his office, reflecting on the day's events. The first incident, the diary's purchase, had generated curiosity and quiet tension. The second, the removal of a seemingly trivial photograph, introduced deliberate action into the sequence, raising questions about motive, opportunity, and the presence of others beyond the immediately obvious suspect. The pattern, he realized, was emerging. Flaxborough's outward calm masked multiple layers of interest, intention, and subtle ambition. The diary, and now the photograph, had catalyzed an array of human behaviors, each revealing a thread of character and possibility. Langford's obvious suspicion remained, but the second incident hinted at complexity beyond initial assumptions, suggesting that understanding would require patience, observation, and careful probing of motivations, both overt and hidden. That evening, as dusk draped Flaxborough in a thin veil of muted gold and the lamps flickered to life along the high street, Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office. The events of the preceding days, the diary's acquisition, the ripple of gossip, Langford's zeal, the mysterious note, and the removal of the photograph formed a complex web in his mind, one that required careful untangling. He poured himself a cup of tea, allowing the silence to settle, and considered the town in its quiet, ordered state. To an observer unfamiliar with Flaxborough, the surface would suggest calm and propriety. Beneath it, however, currents ran deep. Human nature, as he had often noted, preferred the semblance of order, while secretly nursing ambition, resentment, or curiosity. The diary had become a mirror, reflecting these subtleties in precise, revealing detail. Purbright's thoughts turned first to Miss Harrow. Her reactions had been measured, careful, yet the slight tension in her hands, the brief hesitation in her speech, and the faint flicker of curiosity when discussing the diary all indicated a mind both engaged and deliberate. She was cautious, yes, but not naive. There was intelligence in her restraint, an understanding that actions, or even observations, could carry consequences that were not immediately obvious. Then there was Langford, whose scholarly obsession had made him the first obvious suspect. He had been meticulous in his concern, invested emotionally as much as academically. Yet the removal of the photograph suggested that he was not entirely in control. His zeal, when combined with minor lapses or unanticipated developments, revealed both pride and vulnerability. People, he reflected, often reveal more through their inability to anticipate the actions of others than through overt transgression. The note, a trivial scrap of paper with a single cryptic line, had introduced another layer of complexity. Its existence implied observation and intent, though the author remained unknown. Purbright considered who might find such a message useful, a means to provoke reaction, to unsettle, or perhaps to test the responses of those involved. The act was minor, almost delicate, yet it demonstrated foresight and the capacity to manipulate perception subtly. As he sipped his tea, the inspector reflected on the broader human patterns. Flaxborough's residents, when confronted with the diary, had revealed tendencies that were otherwise dormant. Curiosity, rivalry, protectiveness, and pride intertwined, each influencing the other. The diary and the small incidents surrounding it had catalyzed behavior that might otherwise have remained latent for years. Purbright considered the timing and sequence of events. The diary's auction, the young woman's acquisition, the town's reaction, and now the photograph's removal were all linked by human behavior rather than material evidence. The connections were subtle, yet persistent, revealing motives and inclinations that a casual observer might dismiss. He leaned back, allowing his thoughts to drift over patterns he had noted. The slight tremor in Langford's voice, Miss Harrow's careful phrasing, Mrs. Delaney's whispered observations, and the minor but deliberate interventions that had begun to surface. These were all indicators not of guilt or innocence, but of engagement, of interest, and of the invisible pressures that shaped actions in a small town. Purbright recognized that understanding the diary's effect required patience. Human nature was rarely linear. Actions, reactions, and perceptions intersected in ways that were often unpredictable, yet consistent within their own logic. The town, outwardly composed, was in fact a lattice of intention and observation, each resident subtly influencing and being influenced by others. the inspector allowed himself a moment of quiet appreciation for the intricate simplicity of it all. The diary was only a catalyst. The true subject was human behavior, layered, contradictory, and endlessly revealing. By tracing the small signs, the glances, the hesitations, and the carefully measured words, one could discern a pattern, not immediately apparent, but undeniable to the patient observer. As night deepened, Purbright made notes on his observations, organizing the threads without forcing conclusions. He understood that the diary had drawn a small but revealing spotlight onto Flaxborough's character, exposing vulnerabilities, pride, and ambition with the subtlety of a whisper. The town's equilibrium had not been shattered, only illuminated, and in that illumination lay the potential for insight, for understanding, and ultimately for resolution. By the time he extinguished his lamp, he was certain of one thing: the diary's presence had activated a network of intentions and reactions, each quietly interwoven with the social fabric. The stage was set for the next developments, the next interventions, and the subtle tests that would reveal both character and truth. Flaxborough, serene by appearance, was now a living puzzle, one whose pieces whispered hints of a story far more intricate than any single artifact could suggest. The following morning, Flaxborough was as orderly as ever, yet Inspector Purbright sensed the tension beneath the town's usual calm. The diary's influence, the missing photograph, and the cryptic note had collectively created a delicate pattern of anticipation and uncertainty. Purbright, aware that observation alone would not suffice, had devised a subtle test designed to provoke reaction while maintaining the appearance of ordinary engagement. He began with Miss Harrow, inviting her under the pretext of discussing the diary's preservation. She received him with polite composure, arranging the book carefully on the table as she poured tea. Purbright remarked casually on the minor damage that might result from frequent handling, then allowed silence to linger, letting the implied concern hang in the air. Her hands, previously steady, faltered for the briefest moment, betraying a heightened awareness of both the diary and his scrutiny. "I have arranged for a small catalogue of similar manuscripts," Purbright said lightly. "In case you wish to compare handwriting, paper quality, or annotations, it is curious how even minor differences in handling can reveal subtleties in provenance." Miss Harrow's eyes flickered toward the diary, then back to him, and she nodded slowly. "I see," she said, her voice steady but thoughtful. She made no comment beyond that, yet the subtle attention she gave the diary indicated that she was already considering the implications of his suggestion, that the artifacts might be observed, compared, or evaluated by an outsider. Next, Purbright turned his attention toward Mr. Langford. He arranged a meeting at the library under the guise of discussing the historical context of Miss Crimble's social circle. Langford, naturally meticulous, arrived promptly with an expression that suggested he anticipated matters of scholarly importance. "I understand you have compiled a detailed record of Miss Crimble's acquaintances," Purbright said gently, glancing at the neat stacks of papers and correspondence laid out on the table. "Curious how even the smallest annotations can attract attention, isn't it? One may never know who observes the details we consider private." Langford's fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. "Indeed," he replied, voice measured, though a faint edge betrayed the subtle agitation Purbright had predicted. "People often misunderstand the value of careful preservation. One hopes that with diligence nothing untoward occurs." "Of course," Purbright said lightly, allowing the statement to resonate. "Yet one cannot control every variable. It is fascinating how small actions, the arrangement of a diary, a photograph, a note, can ripple through a community, drawing attention where none was intended." Langford's jaw tightened imperceptibly, and he leaned forward as though to assert control over the conversation. The inspector allowed him the space to do so, noting the combination of pride, protectiveness, and latent anxiety that surfaced in response to even the mildest suggestion that someone else might interfere. By mid-afternoon, the subtle tension in Flaxborough was palpable. Conversations in the high street had a sharper edge, glances lingered longer than usual, and minor gestures, the shifting of a hat, the faint adjustment of a coat collar, suggested an increased attentiveness to observation. Purbright walked these streets quietly, noting each sign of agitation without drawing attention to himself. The test had revealed more than words or confessions could have. Miss Harrow's restrained reaction demonstrated curiosity balanced with caution. Langford's tension and precise control indicated pride intertwined with fear of loss. Other townsfolk, though unaware of the inspector's orchestration, displayed minute signs of influence from the diary's presence: slight hesitation in speech, reconsidered gestures, and the faintest tremor in tone when mentioning the past. Purbright returned to his office as the sun dipped low, the streets glowing in the amber of evening. He reviewed the day's subtle interactions, mapping responses against previous observations. The test had not been overt. It required no accusation, no confrontation, only the careful placement of suggestion and the patient recording of human reaction. He allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. The diary, seemingly inert, had become an instrument of revelation. It was not the object itself, nor the physical events surrounding it, that mattered most. It was the responses, the hesitation, the pride, and the curiosity it evoked. Flaxborough had provided the clues, quietly and without spectacle, and the test had simply illuminated them. The inspector sipped his tea, noting the faint sounds of evening settling over the high street. Tomorrow, he reflected, would likely produce the final signs necessary to draw all threads together. By understanding the reactions, by observing the smallest indicators of motive and character, Purbright had positioned himself to see the truth emerge with precision. The town, in its outward calm, had already spoken. He only needed to listen. The following morning, the high street of Flaxborough appeared serene, the faint mist dissolving beneath a tentative sun. Yet Inspector Purbright sensed the currents of tension that had been quietly building over the past week. Every glance, gesture, and carefully chosen word now carried amplified significance, and he had arranged a meeting that would bring these threads together with gentle precision. He invited Miss Harrow and Mr. Langford to the library, ostensibly for a discussion on the historical significance of Miss Crimble's diary. Both arrived punctually, Miss Harrow composed, Langford meticulous yet faintly taut in demeanour. Purbright greeted them with polite cordiality, gesturing toward the table where the diary rested, accompanied by the carefully replaced photograph. "Thank you for coming," Purbright began, his tone unobtrusive, yet with a subtle weight that commanded attention. "I wished to review the diary's context and its effect upon the town. It seems minor objects have a curious way of provoking disproportionate reactions, does it not?" Langford adjusted his spectacles, leaning slightly forward. "Indeed, Inspector, one might say that certain items carry significance far beyond their apparent substance." Purbright nodded. "Exactly. And yet it is not the items themselves that reveal the most, but the responses they evoke. Curiosity, vigilance, and sometimes even intervention occur where one would least expect them." He paused, allowing the statement to linger. Then, with the quiet precision that characterized his method, he began recounting observations. Consider the diary's acquisition by Miss Harrow. Many assumed almost instinctively that interest would focus on her alone. Yet the first significant action, the removal of the photograph, demonstrated that others were watching, responding, and in subtle ways, a tempting influence. Langford shifted, his fingers twitching, as he listened. Miss Harrow remained composed, though a slight furrow appeared between her brows, betraying attention to detail and comprehension. "Mr. Langford," Purbright continued, "your attention to the diary has been remarkable, precise, meticulous, and occasionally, if I may, overzealous. Yet when the photograph vanished, you were not in its immediate vicinity. It is understandable that one might feel implicated merely by association, but evidence, or more accurately behavior, tells another story." Langford opened his mouth, then closed it, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch, observing the subtle micro-expressions. A tightening of lips, the slight arch of an eyebrow, the flicker of hesitation in tone. "Miss Harrow," Purbright said, turning slightly, "you handled the diary with care, as expected. Yet the note left beneath your door and the responses it provoked reveal a quiet tension. The presence of a third party observing events closely. Someone who, while not seeking notoriety, wished to draw attention without causing alarm." Miss Harrow's eyes widened fractionally, just enough to register acknowledgement without alarm. She inclined her head subtly, signaling comprehension without revelation. Purbright continued, drawing the threads together. The town's reactions, the whispers, the minor gestures, and the odd interventions were all reflections of latent intentions. Your careful handling and respect for the diary, coupled with Langford's protective pride, created a pattern observable to those who understood the town's rhythms. Yet it was not Langford who removed the photograph, nor was it anyone intending harm. It was a demonstration, a nudge to reveal attentiveness, to gauge reactions, and perhaps most importantly, to prompt reflection on propriety and curiosity. He paused again, allowing the room to settle under the weight of reasoned observation. Flaxborough, as ever, has shown its character not through overt action, but through subtle behavior. Pride, curiosity, and vigilance have all played their roles. The diary merely highlighted what was already present. Miss Harrow exhaled softly, her composure settling. "So," she said, "there was no malicious intent, merely observation?" "Precisely," Purbright replied with a faint smile. "The truth is often quieter than imagination expects, revealed not through scandal, but through the manner in which people respond to it. The town has demonstrated both restraint and attentiveness, and it is through these small signals that one discerns the whole story." Langford, for the first time in days, relaxed fractionally. His pride remained intact, but the shadow of suspicion lifted subtly, replaced by acknowledgement of the town's delicate equilibrium. Purbright allowed the moment to linger, permitting understanding to settle naturally without the need for dramatic exposition. By the time both visitors departed, the diary was once again the passive center of attention, its presence respected rather than feared. Flaxborough's social fabric, momentarily agitated, had reasserted itself with gentle equilibrium, guided by observation, reflection, and the quiet hand of patient scrutiny. Purbright remained in his office, noting that the smallest details, gestures, hesitation, micro-expressions had revealed more than any overt confession could. In the town's ordinary rhythms, extraordinary truths had emerged without spectacle, exactly as he preferred. By the following morning, Flaxborough had returned to its familiar cadence, though the subtle ripples of the past week lingered beneath the surface. The diary, carefully preserved by Miss Harrow, rested on her table, its presence no longer a catalyst for agitation, but a quiet testament to the town's interconnected curiosities. Inspector Purbright moved along the high street with his usual unobtrusive diligence, noting the soft hum of conversation, the measured exchange of greetings, and the faint, lingering attentiveness in those who had observed the events closely. In the library, Mr. Langford arranged books with his habitual precision, but his posture carried a trace of relaxed authority rather than the taut vigilance of recent days. He glanced toward the diary, now understood in context, and allowed himself a small, private smile, acknowledging that control could coexist with trust and observation. The subtle pride he had nurtured remained, but tempered by the understanding that the town's rhythm relied as much on discretion as on zeal. Miss Harrow moved quietly among her neighbours, offering measured conversation and polite nods. The diary, while still a curiosity, no longer drew whispered speculation. Her careful handling had preserved both the artifact and the town's delicate social equilibrium, earning her cautious respect in circles that had initially regarded her presence with suspicion. The High Street resumed its understated bustle. Mrs. Battersby and Mrs. Penrose engaged in their habitual commentary at the post office, though now tempered by a new awareness. Events could unfold in ways unseen, and observation alone often provided more insight than gossip. Mr. Thornley, the butcher, returned to his precise work with renewed calm, occasionally glancing toward the shop's entrance, as if acknowledging that minor disturbances were part of a larger pattern of behavior. Purbright, in the quiet sanctuary of his office, catalogued the week's events, noting each subtle signal, hesitation, and gesture. The diary had revealed much about human nature: pride, curiosity, protective instinct, and the quiet, almost imperceptible ways people shape events without overt intervention. Observation, patience, and understanding of character had provided clarity far beyond what formal evidence might have yielded. Even the trivialities of the past week had left a mark. The note under Miss Harrow's door, the photograph's temporary removal, and the initial assumptions regarding Langford's involvement were all now understood as part of a delicate dance of attention, restraint, and inadvertent influence. Each resident had played their role, knowingly or not, in the unfolding of the minor mystery that had captivated the town. By evening, the High Street glowed under the warm light of gas lamps. Conversation softened, laughter returned to its ordinary rhythm, and Flaxborough's residents once more settled into the comforting patterns of routine. The diary, silent and inert, had catalyzed reflection and revealed character, yet required no further action. The town itself had provided the resolution through observation, response, and subtle engagement. Purbright lingered in his office, watching the last pedestrians pass. He made notes of the lingering social effects, minor shifts in posture, slight adjustments in speech, and increased attentiveness to small details. These were the quiet signs of equilibrium restored, yet forever changed by awareness. The town, in its ordinary veneer, had absorbed the week's revelations, each resident having participated unwittingly in the pattern of behavior that defined both the problem and its resolution. The inspector allowed himself a final, private reflection. The diary's journey, the small incidents, and the careful orchestration of observation had revealed what any overt investigation might have overlooked. In Flaxborough, as always, the extraordinary lay hidden in the ordinary, waiting to be discerned by those willing to note the subtlest signs. He extinguished his lamp, the quiet of his office matching the calm now settling over the High Street. Outside, the town slept, peaceful yet quietly aware, its rhythm subtly renewed.